Welcome, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is George Krinker. I'm a senior product manager who's worked for Microsoft for a little over 7 years now. And so before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about who I am and what my career has looked like. So I started by being an intern, a PM intern on the SharePoint team, where I got to work on small business websites. Microsoft then extended an offer for me to come back and work full time. I got to work on the Microsoft Delve team. And if you don't know what Delve is, don't worry about it. You can think of it as sort of Pinterest for work. I then did a little bit of a stint in the Outlook Labs team where I got to incubate new Office apps for the Office organization. Got to take apps from like all the way to like ideation and conception to the App Store, and that was a lot of fun. But for the last 4 years, I've been working on the Microsoft Word team, where I've worked in a variety of collaboration features, from all the way from track changes to version history. Autosave was another feature that I worked on, and that's been a blast. I'd like to invite all of you to connect with me. It's a great way to keep the conversation going. It's a great way to, share feedback or ask questions about what we talk about today. So follow me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn. So who is this session for? Well, maybe you're a consumer PM and you've been thinking about what it might look like to work as an enterprise PM or to work on enterprise product. Maybe you've just landed a row, being a PM for an enterprise product, and you're looking to get some ideas, some insights as to how to validate concepts and problems and requirements. Or maybe you are an enterprise PM already, and my hope is that I can still offer some new tips and tricks that you might be able to leverage in your job, and hopefully this presentation will be useful to you as well. What I'm hoping to cover in this presentation today is to begin getting to a shared baseline as to what I mean by enterprise product or enterprise PMing, and talk a little bit about the difference between enterprise product management and consumer product management. Then I hope to talk a little bit about what can be challenging about validating ideas with enterprise customers. And then finally, I'm going to introduce a framework that has worked well for me at my job in the past that hopefully can be useful to you as well. Before we get started, I want to share this really important and quick disclaimer. This talk reflects my opinions, my key takeaways, my insights, and the wisdom that I've collected throughout my career. It does not reflect the opinions or views of my employer. So what do I mean by enterprise product management? Well, for this talk, I'm defining an enterprise PM as one whose company develops products for large organizations rather than individual people or smaller businesses. So for example, if you're a PM working on Netflix, chances are you're a consumer PM because the product you're developing is both used by an individual, by people at home choosing to watch Netflix, and bought by those same people that are choosing to buy Netflix. For enterprise PMing, the most important difference between enterprise product management and consumer product management is that for enterprise PMing, your customer may not be the same person or entity as your user. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that usually the people buying the software are not the same people as the people using the software. And so usually you have a centralized IT department, or maybe it's the CTO or the COO of a company that's writing the checks and choosing what software gets deployed and gets distributed in an organization. And then you have the people in that organization actually using that software that IT has purchased. So for example, you probably have subscribed to Microsoft Office at some point in your life, or maybe gotten a copy of Office after getting a new personal computer. So a lot of people have Office, but did you actually know that the majority of the revenue produced by Microsoft Office actually comes from selling a lot of licenses to big organizations that want their employees to be able to leverage those tools? And usually the sort of classic Office tools that you might know and love, they generally get bundled in a sale or an agreement that sort of sells them, plus maybe some email service or some cloud solution with that. And so that's actually how the majority of revenue in Office gets made. Another example is AWS, where AWS might offer cloud computing anywhere to small independent developers, but also to large organizations that want to run tools in the cloud. And so AWS makes a large portion of their revenue from these large enterprises as well. And then maybe you've heard of Seismic. Seismic is a company that works on marketing and sales enablement tools, and their product is really tailored for larger organizations and really is a great example of an enterprise product. So for this talk, if you're a PM that is developing product for organizations that are large, that have more than 5,000 employees, that might have a sort of IT department or CXO buying the software, that is what I mean by enterprise product management. You might have already picked up on that, but if you haven't yet, then one of the very interesting things that have been happening recently is that the lines between enterprise product and consumer product have been blending. And so even in, for example, in the previous slide, we talked about Microsoft Office. And Microsoft Office is a product that's sold both to consumers and to enterprises. And so it's sort of caught in the middle of this Venn diagram. Now, there are classic companies that you'd think of as companies that mostly sell to enterprise. Companies like Salesforce, Oracle, Cisco, Atlassian, or SAP. They're all companies that sort of have historically sold or catered more towards enterprise. Sometimes we'll consider them B2B companies because they sell to maybe smaller businesses as well, but they focus a ton on large enterprise. That tends to be more their target customer. But yes, the lines between consumer and enterprise are blurring. For example, the Gmail that you use for your personal email might also be the Gmail that your big employer bought to offer email services to all of their employees. Dropbox, for example, you can use Dropbox both for your personal files, and then your enterprise maybe has an agreement with Dropbox to use Dropbox as their sort of file cloud solution. And so as companies start to cater to both consumers and enterprise, that line blurs, and it has interesting ramifications to PMing, interesting ramifications to product development. One, for example, and I don't want to get too much into this, but one is, for example, the sort of expectations of UX that users might have with consumer products. They start to blend in, and they start to be expectations that they might have with enterprise products as well, because they're used to a higher standard of experience. And so in the past, maybe we could get away with not such great user experiences in the enterprise world. Nowadays, it's really important that the UX we put out there for enterprise customers are really, really good. I want to come back to this because I think it's actually one of the most important key takeaways, most important points of the entire presentation. The key difference between enterprise product management and consumer product management is that for enterprise product management, your customer may not be your user. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, as we talked about, there's this IT department buying software and then distributing it to end users in that organization that use the software. Now, you may have the most usable, the most delightful, the app that has the best design in the world, but if you're not solving a problem that your customer believes to be a real problem that's limiting their business growth, then they're never going to buy it. And so end users are never going to see it. Conversely, you might be solving a real problem that your customer really cares about, but if your user experience is not great, then what's going to end up happening is that users in that organization might start filing a bunch of support tickets, and that might become a huge headache for IT to support. Or worst case scenario, users go off and start using their own tools, different tools than the one that IT has purchased. And that's a big problem because eventually IT is going to sort of realize, hey, why am I paying for this software if they're using something else? And churn or abandonment are going to occur. And so a loss of business is going to occur. So it's really, really important as an enterprise PM that we're both delighting both the customer and the end users. Let's say you understand the problems that your customers have, and you even come up with a solution for how to solve that problem. And now you want to sort of validate that sort of this idea for a product that you have, or this idea for a product improvement that you have, is a good idea. How do you go about validating your product idea as an enterprise PM? Well, hopefully it won't surprise you that the answer is actually simple. It's you got to go talk to your customers. And I'm being very intentional when I say talk to customers because I don't mean users. I believe that your first step should always be to talk to your customers because you really need to understand whether what you are like, whether this product you're developing or whether the product improvement you're working on, whether it's solving a real problem or not, that customers are willing to either pay for or that or that it's appealing enough for them that they'd want to deploy in their organization. So talk to your customers even before you talk to your users. Make sure that you're pursuing a worthwhile problem. Now, the good news is that you may actually only need to talk to just a handful of users, customers. Yeah, even I make that mistake sometimes. And that's something that I've both picked up in through experience and realizing that as I've done this many times in the past, and you start to sort of reach the fifth customer that you're talking to, or the sixth or seventh, you start to sort of get to diminishing returns in these conversations. You start to hear the same thing over and over again, get the same kind of data. But it's also supported by research. The Nielsen Group actually has put out papers and research that sort of talk about this idea that it only takes talking to 5 customers to identify the problems with an idea or concept. So, take it from someone who's been doing it for a while, but take it obviously with a grain of salt. Maybe your industry is a little different, but from my experience, generally, it only takes talking to about 5 customers to get most of the insights that you need. And so a natural question is, okay, so how do I get a hold of these customers to interview? How do I get a hold of these IT buyers that might write a check if I'm really solving something that's incredible? So if you're working for an established company already, if you're working for an established product group already, chances are you already have a sales team or a pre-sales team, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that you reach out to them and leverage them to reach out to customers instead of going your own path and trying to talk to customers yourself without an introduction. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that you're probably gonna spend way more time trying to sort of start that relationship out cold. But also, a lot of the times, sales there might be context you're not aware of in sales. Like a customer might be kind of angry at your company, or there might be they might be in there might be a fragile state of a relationship. So you want to make sure that you're not adding more friction into that story. Maybe maybe you're not part of a mature organization, or maybe your product group doesn't have, there's no sales team that you might be able to leverage. In that case, you're more on your own. And I could actually do an entire talk about how to actually answer this question, how to get a hold of customers to interview. Let me know via Twitter or LinkedIn whether that's something that would interest you. But you might be able to leverage channels like LinkedIn to reach out to these IT buyers, to these IT professionals, and see if what you're trying to solve for them gets a response. So I don't want to get too into how to get this done. As I said, I think this is a topic for an entire future session. But those would be the two high-level pieces of advice I'd give in that area. So I said the answer was simple on how to validate a new product or product improvement idea. The answer is simple, but it doesn't make it easy. And so you might think, okay, so I'm going to go off and ask my customers, do they think that this is a good idea? Do they think that this would be valuable? And then I'm going to know the answer, right? Well, unfortunately not. And the reason for that is that there's this little thing called agreement bias that gets in the way. We human beings don't like to upset other human beings. We want to be pleasant. We want them to like us. And so if you go ask people whether they think an idea that you have is good, they're probably going to be try and be positive and say something nice instead of telling you the cold hard truth. And so we need some sort of strategy to go out there and interview these customers to really get a sense of whether the sort of product idea that we have is worthwhile or not. And so what has worked well for me in the past is to try and get to the various levels of validation, and walk the customer through through series of questions that get to where they are with a certain product improvement idea. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the money slide. This is the framework I use when trying to validate my concepts or my product ideas with customers. So what I'll try and do is I'll try and construct the customer interview, so that I'm sort of going through these levels of validation, these litmus tests, to see where customers stand with this concept. So I'll first try and check whether indeed the customer thinks that this is a valuable problem to solve for their organizations. Then I try and get a sense whether they can tell me what roles or departments we're looking for user segments here in their organization that would use the product feature the most. I check whether they've tried to solve the problem before, whether there are existing solutions in their organization today that are trying to solve this problem but maybe aren't doing a great job. And then it's really important to sort of pay attention to whether they're asking, are they proactively asking when this is coming? Because that's a sign of excitement, that's a sign of customer appeal. And then finally, we want as much as possible for our customers to want to pay for the things that we develop. And so we'll test whether IT buyers could tell us a price that they'd be willing to pay for this product feature. That's a great guerrilla way to test whether they'd be willing to pay for something or not. So we walk through a series of questions that try and get to these levels of validation. And we start with sort of the less specific question, all the way to the most specific question at the end. And so, for example, imagine that a customer says that the product or idea would be really valuable to organizations. They say maybe that this would be really, really useful in their legal department, but they don't talk about how they've tried to solve the problem before. Well, that's potentially a customer that cares less about this problem than say one that tells you it's valuable, tells you what roles departments would leverage this. Talks about how they've tried to solve this before, but maybe the solution was too expensive or didn't work with their current setup, and also proactively, keeps asking, hey, so when is this going to be delivered? When can you deliver on this? Like, that's a customer that has responded better to this concept than the other. So there are various ways to test or to ask the question around whether an idea would be valuable to a IT buyer's organization or not. One that we use a lot and that works quite well with a variety of different concepts is to simply ask, the IT buyer during the interview to pick on a scale from 1 to 5 how valuable the idea you're putting in front of them are to their organization. And so, if 5 out of 5 is the most valuable, then what we generally say is that you want at least 90% of your respondents to say that something's 5 out of 5 valuable, because if you're getting a lot of 4s out of 5, you're probably hitting agreement bias again, and so we sort of use that rule of thumb of 90%. But as you start to sort of test various concepts and various ideas in front of your customer, you'll start to be able to benchmark the results of a concept with that of another. And then finally, the other thing you can do as well that's really helpful is to actually ask your customers to stack rank different ideas and concepts from most valuable, say, to least valuable. And so whenever you're sort of, you end up like pitching these ideas against each other and seeing what tends to bubble to the top across various interviews. The reason I ask IT buyers to talk about what roles or departments they could see using the offering or the other concept I present to them the most is that I'm trying to distinguish between a real problem versus a fictitious one. So if someone from IT can't tell me who would benefit from this the most, chances are it's not a problem that keeps bubbling up to them. It's not a problem that their end users keep bringing up, either via support or through other channels. Again, we're trying to get to problems that are real pain points. The reason I ask IT buyers to talk about how they might have tried to solve the problem that we're discussing before or how they're solving it today is that I'm trying to get a degree of how painful the problem actually is. painful problems get solved one way or another, whether it's by a good solution or a subpar solution, and you're sort of hoping for the latter. So I asked them what solutions they've looked into before. Maybe they looked into um, a different a different app or a different vendor to try and solve this problem. Maybe it was too expensive or didn't work with their architecture, or maybe it didn't meet all their needs. And then if they're already solving the problem in some way today, I'll ask them to talk about that a little bit because the insights you might get from that conversation are probably going to be super helpful and super interesting for the design process anyway. So it's a good thing to talk about and spend some time on. So throughout the interview, one of the things you're watching for is whether the IT buyer or the IT admin is proactively asking you, hey, when is this coming? Do you have a timeline for this yet? When do you expect to be able to deliver this? These can all be signs that the customer is excited about what you're showing them, and so it's a good thing to watch for. But it's really, really important that you distinguish between excitement and anxiety. A lot of the times, large enterprise customers are risk adverse, and changes to how their end users work can often be disruptive at first. And so, a IT customer might be anticipating having to do what they call change management, and you want to make sure that you are able to distinguish between excitement for the solution versus I want to know when this is going to come so I can plan ahead and prepare myself. Last but not least, you want to test whether your customer is willing to pay for the idea you're putting in front of them. And that can actually be quite tricky. It's tricky to ask about pricing in a way that isn't biased, because there's several different ways you could bias that question. But we've actually tried a few different variations on how to ask that question. And one that's worked quite well is to ask a customer what they think a fair price per user per month, in case of a SaaS product, obviously, they'd be willing to pay for a feature or product improvement. That tends to get rid of a few important biases like anchoring bias, and a few others. And you're trying to watch for specific, reasonable, realistic answers. So if you're hearing answers like "I'm not really sure," or "I'd have to see," or "I'd pay, but I'm not sure right now," or "I'd actually just expect this to come for free with my existing plan or my existing subscription," then chances are this customer is not willing to pay an additional marginal piece of revenue for this offering. And so you want to see all your customers sort of converge towards a similar, reasonable price for that offering. And the last thing I'll say about this is kind of a guerrilla way to test willingness to pay. If you have a marketing team or a business planning team, there are more scientific ways to test willingness to pay. Like you could do market research or conjoint analysis, and those will give you more trustworthy data. But as an enterprise PM, I'm always trying to sort of get a preliminary sense of whether the concept I'm working on and the concept that I'm pursuing has willingness to pay or not, and that's a way you can do it. One last thing to watch for and to test when doing your customer interviews is to check whether the IT buyer or the IT admin is willing to connect you with a couple of their end users, a few of their end users, to have further conversations about this concept, this product improvement or feature idea. And we've sort of talked about this before, but IT admins are risk adverse, and they're there to provide tools for their employees that will make them more efficient, that will make them better at their jobs. And if they really believe that what you have is sort of aligned to those goals, then they won't mind distracting a few of their employees for a limited amount of time to help you get to the goal of delivering this product. And so, hey, if you can get a customer to connect you with a few end users, maybe as a follow-up from that interview, then you know that you're on the right path to actually building something that's valuable to your customer. All right, so let's recap what we talked about today. So we first started by defining enterprise products as those sold to large organizations instead of individuals or small businesses. We talked about the importance of understanding that in enterprise PMing, your customer may not be your user and what the ramifications of that are. We talked about how the best way to test a new product idea or concept is through talking to your customers, and you might only need to talk to about 5 of them to have useful data. We briefly touched on how it can get tricky to get a real sense of whether something is an appealing idea or not because of biases like agreement bias, and how you can overcome that by constructing your customer interviews that validate a concept through various levels of validation so that the great ideas bubble to the top and become apparent. Before I go, I wanted to suggest some further reading and make some acknowledgments. I wanted to first thank Blair Reeves and Benjamin Gaines for their great book on building products for the enterprise. I think it was an important inspiration for this talk, as well as a useful resource in putting together the material, as well as the Consumer versus Enterprise Product Management Complete Guide. That's an article that you should also read if you can. That was also used in putting together the content for this conversation. Last but not least, I really wanted to thank my colleagues, my teammates, my mentors at work, and all of my customers at Microsoft that have sort of helped shape, my thinking and my career to this point. They've had a huge impact on my work and personal life, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. I really think that I stand on the shoulders of giants. And if you're still watching, thank you. I'm going to end this conversation the same way that I started, with an open invitation for us to keep the conversation going through social media. So if you're on Twitter, or if you're on LinkedIn, follow me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer any questions over there, discuss the stuff we talked about today. Maybe you have ideas on how to make this framework better. Maybe you just want to talk about product management or tech. Just do stay in touch. And one last thing, if I do end up getting at least 30 followers from this conversation, from this presentation, I'm going to be releasing a follow-up blog post with a few sample interview questions that have worked well for me in the past. So if you think that something like this would be valuable for you, please go ahead and follow me. And until next time, thank you very much.